Click for biology. We're looking here at eukaryotic cell structure, and in particular at animal cells. And we've already understood from eukaryotic cell structure that these are cells in which we have a membrane-bound nucleus in which we have the genetic material, the DNA. And in this particular case, we're going to look at the features of what we call animal cells. So remember that animal cells are multicellular organisms. They do not have a cell wall. You'll have recalled that from previous videos. So let's go through their actual structure then. So here's the nucleus that contains the genetic material, which will take the form of DNA. And amongst other things, the DNA has sections of the DNA which are called genes, and these carry the genetic code for proteins. Other features of the cell are the cell membrane. The cell membrane is responsible for controlling what goes into the cell and what goes out of the cell. So notice that I used the phrase control. So the membrane is actively involved in deciding whether molecules can diffuse through, or we have osmosis or active transport. And it's an active structure, largely composed of lipid, but with a good number of protein structures within it, responsible for the transport of particular molecules across the cell membrane. You'll remember that one of the characteristics of life is the production of ATP in the process known as respiration. And respiration is associated with an organelle called a mitochondria. And so we can see here that the mitochondria is a double membrane structure. There are usually a good number of mitochondria within a cell, but the more that a cell demands ATP, then the more mitochondria it would have. And so, for instance, we could have neurons, cells of the nervous system. We could have muscle cells. We could have cells of the liver. Now, these will have a large number of mitochondria because they are required to use a great deal of energy in the form of ATP. This ATP production, just by the way, also requires that oxygen is taken into the cell and into the mitochondria. But we will study this under the topic of respiration. An interesting feature of mitochondria is that the number of mitochondria can actually be increased within a cell, and that would particularly be the case with something like a muscle cell. And so if you train a muscle cell, the number of mitochondria increases within that cell, improving its production of ATP. And of course, this is a cellular example of one's increased fitness. Also within the cell is the structures which are called ribosomes, and these are constructed from what is called RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, similar to the DNA nucleic acids. And the ribosomes are responsible for the building of proteins. Building proteins. And to do that, what happens is that amino acids are taken into the cell and they are joined together in the correct sequence on the ribosome. The correct sequence is dictated by the gene, and we construct the protein. Cells which are very busy in producing proteins will have large numbers of ribosomes. And an example of this could be something like a pancreatic cell, which is producing lots of insulin, the protein insulin, and so it has many, many ribosomes producing lots and lots of insulin. So if you see a diagram of a cell with lots of ribosomes, then you know that it's involved in lots of protein synthesis. If you see a cell with lots of mitochondria, it's a cell which is demanding a great deal of energy. Now, there are very many other chemical reactions that take place inside the cell, and we generalize the region of the cell. We call it the cytoplasm, and inside the cytoplasm are all the metabolic chemical reactions, the chemistry of life, we might say, which is taking place within this animal cell. So that's the basic animal cell. Here's an image of an animal cell as seen with an electron microscope, a little bit more powerful than the ones that you'll see at school, but you will still be able to see very good examples with a light microscope of animal cells. Animal cells, what happens is that the particular genes are expressed, and so we have what we call gene expression. This means that genes are within the nucleus, are switched on, are used, and that will mean that proteins are produced, and those proteins are responsible for the change in shape of the cell as the cell specializes to a particular function. This total process is actually called differentiation. So the cells specialize their shape, and that shape tells us what their function is. And I've drawn 3 examples here to show you. Here's a neuron. Notice that this is got a long extension on here. In fact, motor neurons in the body can be as long as 1 meter. And whilst this is still a tiny cell, its length is this incredible 1 meter, beginning perhaps in the base of your spinal cord and ending in the lower part of the leg. And then we have things like specialized shape of muscle cells. Muscle cells are specialized, and they have the capacity to generate force through what we call contraction. And so inside the muscle cell are specialized shape and structures which allows it to shorten, so it will actually get shorter, and in the process of getting shorter it generates force. And so shape is dictating function. And then we got this very special cell here. This is a single cell with a cell membrane going all the way around the outside like so, and so on, all through the structure here. This is one cell specialized into 3 regions of the tail, the collar, and the head zone, but this is actually just one cell, and this is a sperm cell, and up in the top of the sperm cell in the head structure is the nucleus, which is used in reproduction and fertilization. So cells specialize their shape through gene expression, which produces proteins, which will in turn change the shape, and that shape tells us about the function. So we have this flow of information in this direction. Now we can reverse that logic, and we can look at the shape of a cell, and the shape of the cell will imply its function. We can use this in both directions. We know that that cell must have expressed genes to produce proteins to give it to that particular shape. Here's some questions on animal cells. Complete the questions. Should only take you 2 or 3 minutes, and then check out the answers in the description below, and we can now link you through to the next video in this part of the course, and a chance to subscribe or a link to the playlist.